Jade, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's so nice to be here. Good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. I was wondering maybe we could just start. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Help our listeners understand a little bit about who you are.
I am Jade Rubick, and I am very interested in the intersection between like effective and humane leadership. I have been doing this work for well over 20 years, and I've worked at quite a few different places, at probably approaching 25 to 30 different startups at this point. I've done some of my longer stints as VP of Engineering at New Relic and Gremlin. I've also done a number of interim roles at some other companies. Nowadays, I have a consulting practice, and I help individuals and companies in a number of different ways. First of all, I help as an advisor or a coach. I also help by doing fractional or interim VP of Engineering and VP of Product roles. And finally, I also do group coaching for frontline director and VP level roles. I also write at my blog at rubick.com, and I'm actually starting a podcast pretty soon.
And for our listeners, do check out Jade's blog. It's one I personally read whenever you post a new article, and it just has all sorts of amazing content on areas around team building and execution and velocity. And I think the topic for today's show, product strategy. For context, when we were years ago first starting with Ops Level and thinking about our own product strategy, I found it challenging. There wasn't a lot that was written out there. And when I found your blog post, it really helped just make concrete how to go about defining a product strategy. So I'd love to talk about that today. Maybe we just level set. Like, can you define what a product strategy is?
I've learned from a number of different sources on this, and you find that a lot of different sources will use the term strategy very, very differently. I basically take the good strategy, bad strategy definition, which is basically product strategy is kind of looking at your existing situation, synthesizing that, and making an opinion about like what is the most important part of your situation to solve, and then developing an approach to addressing that. So it's basically problem solving, but it involves like taking the very complex situation you're in and distilling it. So it's a diagnosis and a remedy kind of packaged together.
Now, that sounds useful, right? It sounds like a prioritization kind of challenge to understand where you sit and understanding what are the problems you face and how to solve them. What are some of the common problems you've sort of seen as companies kind of attempt to define a product strategy?
It's actually much easier to talk about the pitfalls because there are so many of them. I mean, basically, there are a lot of examples of pitfalls that people get into as they're developing a strategy. I think, first of all, a very common mistake that people make is that they wait too long to develop a strategy. I've seen a lot of leaders be like, hey, the product strategy is coming, and they'll spend a couple months working on it, and then they'll be like, well, it's still coming, and they'll still work on that. I think it's important to always kind of have a stance on what your strategy is, even if it's admittedly interim. Some other common examples, I think it's very common for people to state a goal as a strategy. And it's important to recognize what your goals are and what your aspirations are, but those are not strategy.
Would an example be like, we want to be the market leader? Like, yes, we all do. That's your goal. But like, what is your actual path to getting there?
Exactly. You have to have a path to get there. And I would say a goal of getting to be the market leader isn't even, you're not correctly diagnosing the situation. Like the strategy needs to contain an analysis of what your obstacles are. So if your aspiration is to become the market leader, your strategy needs to contain like what is in the way and how you're going to approach get the path to becoming the market leader. So it's a little bit more, it's looking at it with a little more depth, I think. I also think there's some other pitfalls I'll just list real quickly. A roadmap is not a strategy. Explaining your thinking is not a strategy. Strategy that includes everything you want to do is also not strategy. Like it has to be very narrow, targeted, and it has to focus your energies.
I really like that last point about a strategy is not everything you want to do, because I think to your point earlier, a strategy has to be focused. It has to be, there's a prioritization decision that has to come from a strategy to say, like, these are the areas we're going to invest in. Because it'd be lovely, yes, if we could invest in everything, but that's generally not realistic. Or you can, but it'll be so shallow, that investment, that it's not actually going to differentiate you in any like main area.
I think also as your company becomes bigger, there can be a pressure to include everything in your strategy, because people will feel left out if they're not included in the product strategy. They'll be like, oh, we're not important. And so there can be a kind of like a temptation to say, so these are the things we're focusing on, and these things are also important. And I think, there may be some political reasons for doing those sorts of things that may make sense in certain contexts. But generally, the core of your strategy needs to be very focused.
Where my mind kind of goes when I think about that is products that already have a large surface area, but there's some new dimension that they're expanding in. So it's like our focus is this, but we do still have this entire product surface area we have to maintain. Has that been sort of the experience you've seen?
That's a very common situation, and also totally appropriate for a strategy. Like this is the area that we think that is critical for our success. We may be doing some other things that are also important. Like, let's say your strategy is to become the, there's a lot of different strategies, but let's say, I'm just making this up off the top of my head, but let's say your strategy is to become the most cost-effective product in a particular segment. And you're going to target this segment of customers, and you're going to be successful because that you can offer that less expensively and in better quality than any of the competitors, and that's something those customers really care about. That could be your strategy, but you could also be doing some things around improving your onboarding process or whatever else may make sense for your company. That makes sense. It makes sense to improve other things as well. But if there's ever a conflict between those two things, you probably want to focus on the things that are core to your strategy.
Yeah, I think my takeaway from this is that you have your strategy, which is sort of like your guiding light. It's how you're going to win. You might have other things on your roadmap, and that's okay. They shouldn't be in conflict with your strategy, but you might have other supporting work that you just have to do for either existing functionality or onboarding or things that aren't directly against your strategy, but just product functionality you need to support.
Absolutely. I think we have to be careful not to be too mechanistic about almost anything we do when we're thinking about product. For example, if you prioritize your roadmap based on perceived economic impact on the company, or based on the ARR of your customers, like I've seen that happen a lot. That's a very common way of prioritizing. I think that should just be one input into your overall thinking, and you have to be able to do your best thinking, because you're dealing with a very complex environment, and there can be a lot of reasons to prioritize things differently.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think we can talk a little bit about roadmap and prioritization. I'd love to talk about. So you talked about what a strategy isn't, right? Like, yes. What is a strategy? Like, what are some of the key components that kind of go up into making a comprehensive product strategy? If I gave you something and said, okay, Jade, I finished our product strategy. Like, this is it. Like, what are the hallmarks you would look at to evaluate me and say either, Ken, this is amazing, or actually, Ken, no, this isn't a product strategy. Here's what you do need.
Yeah. So I follow the good strategy, bad strategy pattern a lot. I really lean on that book quite a bit. And he lists 3 parts to a strategy. So the 3 parts he lists are a diagnosis that kind of defines your challenge, a guiding policy, which is basically your overall approach, and then a set of coherent actions that you're going to take. I generally focus on the first two of those because I find that the execution on the strategy is generally less the problem. Like the hard thinking you have to do is about like, what is your actual situation and how are you going to approach that? And I generally find both of those are the areas that people struggle with the most. And actually executing on the strategy, it can be a challenge. It's probably more of a challenge in larger organizations. I tend to work in smaller organizations, so that just hasn't been the pain point for me. So, so basically, it's these first two things, which is that you need a critique of your current complicated environment. Like, what are the most crucial elements of the problems that you need to solve? And you should have a theory of like what is essential. You have to distill your current situation down into like a critique of your situation. And then you need some sort of well thought out plan for what will improve your situation. It should be something that is like realistic, pragmatic, and you should have confidence that it should improve your company's situation. And, ideally, you should even be able to like throw some numbers at it or do some back of the envelope math on it. You can't always do that. Like sometimes your situation is complex enough or uncertain enough that you're making bets that you're really not totally sure. And sometimes part of your strategy can actually be to uncover what you don't know. But basically, this is like your best thinking of how you're going to improve your company's situation. Mm-hmm. And I usually find that both of those steps, people don't spend enough time and discussion on, like really developing a shared understanding of like the fundamental problem you're facing and how you're going to tackle it.
Jade, as you kind of think about, clients you worked with around helping them with their product strategy, are there any kind of themes that you've seen in those diagnoses or the kind of like the market pressures that they're facing? Like, I'd love to try to concretize it. When you say a diagnosis or a critique, what would an example one be?
Well, let's say you have a product that it's an enterprise product and you're getting a lot of traction with a particular like early adopters. But one of the things you're struggling with is that those early adopters are partially really hiring you for your expertise. So you have a product, but your product is also offering a lot of services. So it may be that your core problem is that your product appeals to early adopters, or it may be that your core problem is you actually have a services business and you're trying to switch into a product business. And so basically that's kind of like the type of problem statements that companies need to grapple with. Like, what is your core problem then? Is your core problem that you need a different product? Is your core problem that you haven't fully productized your services? You need to kind of develop a stance on that type of business problem. Sometimes the situation is a little different. Maybe you're in a market where you're a little bit less differentiated. You have competitors that are offering very similar offerings. What do you do in that case? Is the core problem that you're not different? You're not differentiated? Maybe you need to focus on innovation. Is it possible to innovate in such an environment? Should you be focusing on being like the cost leader, the most cost efficient? Or should you be focused on just providing the best overall experience? And so those are the type of like trade-offs that I think that people need to really dig into when they're doing product strategy work.
Got it. And it sounds again like it's an understanding of like, here's the market that we're in, here's the competitors that are out there, here's the goal that we have, right? So the example you gave about you're a product and services business. Like if we want to be a product business, then okay, how do we now orient and digging into like, okay, is it that our product is underbuilt? Is that people really care more for the services? We need to get more of that service context into the product, but understanding, how are we going to now achieve that goal and solve that problem kind of given these market conditions?
Yeah. And what I find is sometimes leaders don't really engage in these discussions enough. They don't like, there can be all these competing theories of like what the core business problems are and they don't get resolved. Like, and so sometimes this is actually like it's actually a leadership problem that they're not coming together and really formulating a shared understanding of what the core problem for the business is. And sometimes it will just happen like in these weekly like meetings, and months can pass before you actually discuss these things, or you never fully get on the same page. And I think that's often the core problem with strategy work, is that you actually have to really accelerate these type of conversations, and you have to be doing them on a little bit more regular basis. I once, I don't know, remember if this is true. I might have gotten this out of the Steve Jobs biography, but I believe he used to spend most of his Mondays almost completely talking about the future with Steve Jobs would spend almost his entire Mondays just talking about the future with his like product leadership. And they would basically just talk about all the different scenarios and like what were the problems that they were trying to solve and what should the solution of the future look like. And if you think about it, I think that type of like future focus and like forward-thinking business like conversations, that's really rare. I don't think I've ever seen that in any of the companies I've been at. And it takes a lot of like rigor and alignment and like to basically make that such a priority when you have so many other competing demands on you.
I can definitely imagine that, especially in startup land, there's always work to do.
It's impossible. It's so hard.
Yeah. But to your point, you need to kind of rise above and say, okay, but like we're operating without a plan, or, we might have like implicitly some overlap or maybe some disjointedness in terms of where we align on things. But if you don't actually like carve out and say, this is the product strategy, this is the plan we're now executing against, wheels are turning, but are you actually going in any coherent direction?
I generally find on leadership teams, the two things that are most lacking is like high quality discourse about the future and also coordination around execution. So once you do have a product strategy, that hopefully should inspire all the parties involved to coordinate their work in a way that produces outsized impact. And if you have a really good product strategy, I think that can drive incredible results. But I often find that those two parts are lacking. One or the other or both is usually lacking in most companies that I've come into contact with.
How should organizations kind of go about defining their product strategy then, right? If you've observed this problem that like it's sort of this left sometimes implicitly or never really prioritized, like who should actually be involved? And can you walk us through kind of the steps and considerations at each stage of actually formulating that product strategy?
That's a wonderful question. And I think it depends a lot. There's a lot of different factors. Like there's the size of the company. There's how product focused the CEO is. It can depend on how the executive team works together. It can also, like in a larger company, there might be like an overall company strategy that the product strategy intersects with. I've generally worked in smaller companies, and so I kind of merge those two. Even if you are in a big company, let's just kind of merge talking about company strategy and product strategy. But usually I would say it's either the head of product or the CEO or the entire executive team that kind of drives the development of some sort of strategy. And I think it can be done in a lot of different ways, but often the head of product is the best person to kind of drive this forward and lead it and involve all the other people in kind of getting aligned around it. But the head of product is like really immersed in customer feedback. They have good connections with the go-to-market organization and engineering. And they're often the person that's best able to kind of integrate all of those perspectives, write up their best thinking, get other people to improve the planning and the thinking, and get everybody aligned and get it solidified. They're basically creating the plan that the company operates against. And so it's kind of like a business plan. And so you will sometimes see like the CEO doing it, I think, but often the head of product is the best person to do it.
So task the head of product. They should come up with a advice. Who should they kind of coordinate? You mentioned sort of the CEO. Are there other functions in the company that should be involved in the kind of curation or creation of a product strategy?
Yeah, I mean, some of it depends on what the product strategy ends up being, but I think generally it's a very cross-functional view of like, it's a stance on how the company is going to be successful. And so often a good product strategy will provide a blueprint for how all the departments are going to act. So let's say your product strategy is let's say in the earlier example, you have an early adopter product. You're focusing on making it a product that is more usable by less experienced users. And you also, let's say, so you're kind of focusing on that. And let's say you're also focusing on cost effectiveness. And that's how, like, you've looked at the competition, you looked at the space, and you're like, that's how we're going to succeed. Then that has implications on every department. Sales may need to structure themselves so that they can their sales motion can be very cost effective. Maybe there's a particular part of the market that we're going to be focusing on. So that affects marketing and sales. For engineering, the cost effectiveness portion is definitely going to drive a lot of decisions and a lot of principles that the engineering department's going to operate under. The fact that the product is going to be focusing on a different kind of customer segment has a lot of implications for product and for design, and they need to like be working with engineering in order to shift the product that way. And so really, like, this product strategy should be a blueprint for how all these teams work together. So to get back to your question, I think all of these like functions have to have some sort of input or critique of the product strategy and how it affects them and what the trade-offs are of focusing on that. So generally what I see happening is that the product leader will kind of put down their best thinking. They'll get aligned on it with the CEO, and then they'll start like working with the different department heads to improve that plan and look at the trade-offs of these plan, and kind of they gradually widen it until the entire executive team is on board with it.
It also sounds like then the product strategy isn't sort of like a one and done. It's not like the head of product goes like to the top of the mountain, writes this thing, comes down to the CEO, gets approval, and then rolls out. It's this sort of iterative process as you kind of work through the organization, getting that input from different groups, understand how they'll be impacted by the strategy and how the strategy actually will impact their execution.
That's generally the way I've seen it. The product leaders I've seen do this most successfully have been very smart about how they involve others in it. They've like, you don't want to involve too many people in it at the wrong times, and you're basically kind of being strategic almost of like how you involve people in it and gradually expand that list till ultimately it's like the whole company. But I think basically like you want to get to the point where the executive team is all aligned with it. And so that's kind of the first stage of it. And then there's also like a communication aspect of it and all that, which is kind of a separate topic.
I want to actually touch on something else. Also on your blog, you've written about this idea of a product council. And I think this was from your time at New Relic. And the product council was a mechanism or a way to generate a product strategy. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, how does the product council kind of function within the organization? Who's involved in it? And how does that help align product strategy with the actual business objectives?
Product council is one of a number of different approaches you can take. That basically, I think that strategy and execution are generally more intertwined than most people think. A lot of this, like a lot of our product strategy is about how you can coordinate the efforts of the company towards executing on the strategy. And this can happen at a lot of different levels. Like, one is that the executive team needs to function in a like coordinated and cooperative fashion. But within the product development organization, one thing that can be really useful and help make a product strategy successful is a lot of clarity on like the trade-offs of a strategic direction. And so if an organization is large enough, it can be really helpful to have like the product leadership working with like head of architecture or like the head of design, and really kind of looking at a lot of the larger initiatives that are going on in the company and explicitly prioritizing them. So this is, our product strategy is this, our top priority is this, but we also have this like GDPR compliance project that has to happen, but it's not part of our product strategy, but that's actually the top priority. Because if we don't do that, we're going to have all these fines or can't sell in Europe or whatever. So that's actually our top priority. And the strategy is number two, that big project around that is number two. It's just really good to be explicit about those priorities, because especially as your organization grows, there's teams that are going to be getting like requests from multiple places, and they might have like very important people that their job is like their success of this leader depends on them like kind of cramming this work down this poor team's throat. And it can be very helpful to have these very explicit priorities that the manager of that team can be like, hey, sorry, I'm I'd love to be able to help you out, but the product council has explicitly prioritized like your work second. And so, you should make it really clear that that's the trade-off we're making. It gives them kind of a defense so that they don't have to be quite as under the gun all the time. So basically, like what the product council can do is it could help like provide a prioritization mechanism for the entire product development organization. And it can be a place where like future strategic initiatives are discussed. So you can kind of be like, hey, there's this other kind of developing potential business problem. Let's kind of talk about the implications of that, do some research on it, and potentially like that could influence next year's product strategy. Or if it's important enough, maybe it might be something that causes us to shift our product strategy. At New Relic, where I first came into contact with the product council idea, it was brought in by a consultant named Jim Shore, and it, people actually had very mixed reactions to the product council. Some people didn't like it. Some people thought it was amazing. But the thing that the product council, there was a time in New Relic's history where we had made our product strategy had been, we have to succeed in the enterprise for us to reach our growth levels. We are going to explicitly focus on enterprise features, and we are going to be more responsive to like sales needs. And there were a lot of different, like very explicit portions of that. And we're explicitly not going to focus on some of these other things. So we canceled or delayed a couple of different product lines that we had been focusing on. And we basically really focused on winning in the enterprise. The strategy was a little bit more like well laid out than that, but essentially that's what we were trying to do. And that was going actually pretty well. The business focused on that. We were very successful. We grew quite a bit. But at some point, somebody was like kind of raising the alarm that while we were doing that, we weren't paying enough attention to how quickly distributed tracing and the move to microservices architectures were really changing the way that people were developing applications. And New Relic really kind of missed the ball on that. We were so focused on one
enterprise
element.
Upmarket. Yeah.
Yeah. That we missed that, how quickly that was shifting. But I will say the product council did provide a mechanism for somebody to raise the alarm and say, oh my God, this is terrible. Like, and they were able to like make a case and very quickly like switch the product strategy to be, okay, we've focused a lot on the enterprise. We actually need to like make sure that we turn around this situation. And that was something that like a single product manager did, made the case for it. And the product council kind of like basically was like, you're right. We need to like, what are we going to do about that? And so it very quickly shaped the execution for the whole company, really.
I wanted to lean into that more, right? Like, so product strategy kind of exists, kind of given a set of conditions about a market. Like to your point earlier, you have this diagnosis phase where it's like, hey, here's the market, here's the competitors, here's where we sit, here's our goal, here's where we're trying to get to. But those market conditions can change, right? Like you brought up the example of the rise of microservices and distributed tracing. Most recently, I think on the economic front, the end of zero interest rate policy and the kind of lack of capital in tech and the floods of layoffs that I don't know, flood, but lots of layoffs we've been seeing kind of over the last year and a half. How often should product leaders be reevaluating their product strategy?
Well, I think it should be reevaluated pretty continually. Like the example from, possibly apocryphal example from Steve Jobs, I think is actually kind of a nice model for like the level of like continuous introspection into your environment you should be doing. Essentially, what you're doing is you're balancing your future focus and your kind of sensing of your environment with kind of your action against that environment. And so every organization probably is going to need to decide how much they're going to emphasize each. I would say in general, companies err on the side of not doing enough sensing of their environment and like not just sensing it, but really like distilling down what they're learning and kind of like really grappling with the problems ahead of them. But I guess I would say if your core problem that you're facing has changed, or if your efforts to address that core problem are not making progress, or you're seeing evidence that like your environment is shifting, I think those are all signs that your product strategy needs to be revised. And I guess I've seen companies where they haven't changed their product strategy for a couple of years. In the startup world, that's maybe a little bit less common. And also, I sometimes find that not shifting your product strategy for a couple of years, sometimes that's because the product strategy actually hasn't been as fully fleshed out, maybe, as it should be. Yeah. But I would say, like, the kind of norm is to refresh it once a year. And I think like you should at least like review your product strategy and make sure you really believe everything in it at least once a year.
And to the point earlier about like indicators, it's like if you feel your core problem has changed, if your efforts aren't having impact, or if you have that, again, in the New Relic case, you're seeing some evidence that the environment is shifting, right? And the thing that you thought is your biggest problem actually may not be your biggest problem anymore.
Yeah. And sometimes a product strategy is operating with a lot of uncertainty. And so sometimes you'll make parts of your product strategy be things that you're not totally sure about. And so that can sometimes be kind of built into it, where you're like, this is something we need to investigate, we need to test out, we need, like, our hypothesis is that this is the actual core problem, but we will know better after we do
a little bit of work and investigation, in that area.
Yeah. And then sometimes, after actually doing that investigation, you may have a better idea if you're on the right track.
That makes a ton of sense. I want to ask one final question around kind of scale. Because, you mentioned sort of New Relic, right? Large public company versus a lot of your clients that are startups, which are not public and much smaller. Are there any sort of differences that you've seen in approaches to product strategy between small and large companies, right? Like, and also as a company grows, how should they sort of think about evolving their product strategy and their approach to creating it?
I've only observed in, like New Relic style or New Relic sized companies. I've only really observed at that level. I've been less involved in shaping the strategy. Although I had some limited involvement then. And so I guess what I've observed is that it's a lot more political as you get larger, and it's a lot more there's a lot more about kind of communicating the strategy, or I guess another thing I observed is that there was a lot more divergence in what people thought should happen. And so a lot of what you may actually have a lot more like detractors or people that are actively opposed to your approach when you are working on a larger company. That can happen at a smaller company as well, but it seems like the kind of like the actual work of putting together the strategy is just going to be a lot harder in a larger company.
I have an assumption there that it's because people at different levels in a large organization have different vantage points about what the problems faced by the org. Like, the classic example is a bunch of people surrounding an elephant with a blindfold on. And it's like, oh, I feel the tail, or I feel the trunk, or I feel the not the hoof, the tusk and the toenail, right? And it's like, you all see different parts, but there's an elephant that's wholly there. And similarly, like, I don't know, I'll pick on a security team, cares a lot about like security and compliance and no GDPR, whereas the head of product might be recognizing, or a certain product manager might be realizing, the strategic threat you pointed out about changes in technology adoption of microservices.
I think that's really true. The larger the company becomes, the less each person actually fully understands the picture generally. And you also can get into incentive problems where there's like people's own careers can be wrapped up with the, what strategic direction you choose. And so there's almost like more conflict of interest in a larger company.
So I guess, as if you are a successful startup and you have the luxury of scaling, it sounds like just watch out for politics as you're defining your product strategy, or that you recognize you might have to invest a lot of time getting buy-in on alignment for like, these are the problems we're seeing, and trying to reconcile, here's the worldview that the head of product is sort of constructing against the kind of localized worldview that whoever you're speaking with might have.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Awesome. Well, listen, Jade, before we wrap up, I always love to ask our guests, what is your favorite music to kind of listen to or do work against?
That's a great question. I don't generally listen to music while I work, but some of my favorite music recently it's not like it's super recent music, but I've been listening a lot to Metric and Lord. So that's when I look at my music over the last couple of years, they are disproportionately represented. I listen to them a lot.
I know the one Lord song, Royals. I think it comes on the radio kind of often. That was like their one big single. So cool.
That's great.
And Jade, you mentioned your blog earlier, but what is the best way for people to follow your work kind of on the internet or on social media?
Yeah, so you can subscribe to my newsletter at rubick.com, and you can also see a lot of my, like, how to contact me or links to my LinkedIn, things like that at rubick.com. I have a newsletter there that basically gives you a weekly, I call it Engineering Leadership Weekly. And so it gives you basically all the things that I've written are kind of metered out to week by week. So you get about a year and a quarter of content if you sign up. And that's free. That's at rubick.com. And that's probably the best way to get a hold of me, or LinkedIn. On LinkedIn, I post several times a week, just little blurbs on leadership from things I've written or things I've read. And I just generally like sharing what I've learned. And sometimes I feature things from other people that are writing about leadership, and just anything I find interesting or insightful.
Cool. Well, everyone, feel free to follow Jade on his blog and LinkedIn. Do subscribe to his newsletter, and we're going to be including all the information in the show description below. So yeah, today we talked about product strategy. We talked about what it is. We talked about what it is not, right? It is not a roadmap, and it is not a goal. We also talked about how to create a winning product strategy, and how to kind of diagnose the problems that you're having and how to effectively communicate a product strategy across your organization. So Jade, I just want to say again, it has been absolutely great having you on the show. I super appreciate you taking the time to join us. And thank you to all of our guests for listening. If you have any topics or other guests that you would like to see on the show, do send us an email at levelup@opslevel.com, and we'll see everybody next time. Happy building.